This is the story of Romeo Phillion, a man wrongfully convicted for the 1972 murder of fireman Leopold Roy. Phillion is regarded as Canada's longest-serving prisoner to have a murder conviction overturned, as he served 31 years behind bars. He was 28 years old at the time of his arrest. Romeo Phillion was born April 29, 1939, in the small town of Cobbold, Ontario. Phillion was the fourth of 9 children. His mother was a housewife, and his father worked at a dry cleaning business. Though a seemingly normal family, Phillion's father was an abusive alcoholic. At the age of 8, Phillion was sent to a school run by a Christian order for orphans and truants. While there, Phillion experienced bullying and sexual abuse. Though the intention of this camp was to convert Phillion into a respectable young man, the opposite seemed to have occurred. Phillion became what authorities refer to as a shiftless drifter, lying and committing petty crimes in order to survive. He additionally consulted with various other two-bit criminals. As a result, Phillion compiled a criminal record with convictions for prostitution, assault, and theft. On August 9, 1967, at 2:45 p.m., Leopold Roy was stabbed to death in the apartment building which he was a superintendent for by an unknown assailant. Prior to the stabbing, Leopold's wife Mildred had noticed the assailant creeping around the apartment building and called for her husband to investigate. Due to the fact Mildred had witnessed the stabbing, she provided a description to police investigators who drew up a composite sketch that was released to the public. A few days later, Gail Brazeau, who was Phillion's sometime girlfriend, mentioned to police that the composite sketch resembled Phillion. As a result of this, Romeo and his twin brother Donald were brought in for a photo lineup. Originally, Mildred had picked Donald Phillion as the man most closely resembling her husband's attacker. Donald was later eliminated as a potential suspect when police learned he was at work in New Liskeard, 511 kilometers away, at the time of the murder. Romeo provided a similar alibi as his brother Donald for the day of the murder. Mildred then suggested that Romeo also resembled her husband's attacker, but expressed she wasn't 100% certain. Due to Gail Brazeau's untrustworthiness and Mildred's uncertainty, Romeo Phillion was released. For 4 years, the investigation made no significant advancements, as the crime scene provided little to no evidence. It is essential to note that during this period, Mildred Roy identified at least 3 other men as potential attackers. Eventually, all 3 men were released and no charges were laid. On January 11, 1972, Phillion and his 18-year-old boyfriend, Neil Miller, were brought in for questioning regarding the armed robbery of a taxi driver. During this, Romeo asked Detective Hunault if Neil Miller had said anything. Hunault decided to play along, suggesting Neil had said a lot about the things you had bragged to him about. This comment immediately prompted Phillion to confess to murdering the fireman. Phillion agreed to sign a full confession on the condition he be able to see Neil Miller. This confession was recanted only hours later to a different officer. With this confession, Phillion was charged with the second-degree stabbing murder of Leopold Roy. Phillion's trial began on October 16, 1972, before a jury. The Crown prosecutors built their case against Phillion on 3 key pieces of evidence. The first was Phillion's confession that was given voluntarily. The second was Mildred Roy's eyewitness identification testimony. And the third was a statement from Neil Miller claiming Phillion had confessed to him about the murder just 4 days prior. Phillion's defense lawyer, Arthur Cogan, presented the argument that Miller and Phillion had planned for Romeo to confess to the murder and have Neil corroborate his confession in order to obtain reward money. Cogan obtained expert opinion from Dr. Gudjonson, who expressed, based on his evaluation, that Phillion suffered from antisocial personality disorder and borderline personality disorder. Gudjonson asserted that the possible interaction between the two disorders may have contributed to Phillion's false confession on January 11, 1972. Two separate experts had concluded that given his disorders, Phillion was likely to lie or invent stories in order to make himself feel important. Cogan, his defense lawyer, additionally highlighted that during the investigation, police officers had lost various pieces of evidence. These pieces of evidence consisted of hair samples taken from Romeo Phillion, fingernail scrapings, blood, and hair samples that were taken from Leopold Roy. Given the missing evidence, Cogan requested that the jury carefully consider the absence of adequate police investigation when deciding their verdict. Despite this, on November 7, 1972, Phillion was found guilty for the stabbing murder of Leopold Roy and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 10 years. In 1990, Phillion walked away from the minimum security prison in Kingston, Ontario, and attempted to rob a bank. Phillion got away with $2,000, took a cab back to the prison, and proceeded to distribute the money amongst other prisoners. During his prison sentence, Phillion attempted suicide various times. It is important to note that despite Phillion having the potential to apply for parole after 10 years, he never did. Phillion refused to apply for parole as he maintained his innocence and knew that without admitting guilt, he would be unlikely to be granted parole. Phillion's first appeal to his conviction was to the Ontario Court of Appeal, but it was dismissed on September 3, 1974. For his second appeal, he applied to the Supreme Court of Canada, but this appeal was dismissed March 22, 1977. In 1998, a file was left inside Phillion's prison cell which contained a written report from Officer John McCombie that provided an alibi for Phillion at the time of the murder. The report that was compiled on April 1968 detailed an interview of a Trenton service worker who confirmed Romeo Phillion was there on the day of the murder between 12 p.m. and 1 p.m. This report was never provided to Phillion or his lawyer previous to his conviction. When later asked why McCombie never mentioned his report, he said, "I was never asked." After 2 failed appeal attempts, Phillion began raising interest in his case through interviews, asserting he would prove his innocence. Phillion claimed he had confessed to the murder of Leopold Roy to ensure his boyfriend of the time, Neil Miller, wouldn't get into trouble. In the early 2000s, Phillion's case was picked up by Aidwick and the Innocence Project. In 2003, Phillion, Aidwick, and the Innocence Project submitted an application to the Minister of Justice under Criminal Code Section 696.1, which allows for case renewal or reopening when new evidence becomes available. Aidwick and the Innocence Project found errors in Phillion's original police statements. For example, he claimed to have thrown bloodied clothes over a bridge, which he took investigators to, but promptly changed his mind and led them to a different bridge, after learning the first was inaccessible by car. During the review of his application on June 21, 2003, the Minister of Justice granted Phillion bail, a landmark decision as he was the first ever prisoner to be granted bail pending case review. On March 5, 2009, the Ontario Court of Appeal overturned Phillion's conviction and ordered a new trial. During the trial where Phillion's conviction was overturned, Detective McCombie testified to a 3-judge panel that evidence to discredit Phillion's alibi, which was originally supported by his report, was discovered. This supposed evidence was a tow record which proved Phillion could have made it back to Ottawa in time to murder Leopold Roy, though no actual evidence to support this claim was ever provided. Given the amount of time that had passed and the prosecution's doubt in an ability to obtain conviction, on April 29, 2010, the Crown withdrew their charges against Romeo Phillion. Though Phillion was now unconvicted, he was left in legal limbo. Having never received the chance to prove his innocence, he was unable to receive compensation for his wrongful conviction. In 2013, Phillion launched a $14 million lawsuit against the Ontario government, the Ottawa Police Service Board, and the original investigators, John McCombie and Stephen Notori, as wrongfully, intentionally, and maliciously conspiring his persecution. In his 68-page statement, Phillion suggests police orchestrated witness statements to support his confession, despite knowing of his innocence. This lawsuit was dismissed by an Ontario Supreme Court judge later in 2013. Despite this, Phillion kept pushing to receive compensation, and in February 2015, the Supreme Court of Canada allowed for his pursuit of justice. Sadly, Romeo Phillion died 9 months later in November 2015, at the age of 76, without completing his lawsuit and receiving compensation. 3 key factors that caused Phillion's wrongful conviction were 1. His false confession that he gave voluntarily. Oftentimes, juries find it hard to believe anyone could willingly falsely confess to a crime they did not commit. 2. Disorganized police investigation, such as the lost samples from both Phillion and Leopold, and the inadequate record of investigations. 3. Eyewitness misidentification. Juries tend to place extreme significance on this type of evidence, despite the fact they are one of the leading causes for wrongful conviction. There is speculation his identity as a bisexual man may have left him susceptible, as a marginal population, to wrongful conviction. Additionally, though not explicitly stated, it is possible his prior criminal record left Phillion more vulnerable. Due to these factors, in addition to his refusal to seek parole and admit guilt for the 1967 murder of Leopold Roy, Romeo Phillion is the longest-serving prisoner in Canadian history to have a murder conviction overturned. As a result of his case, prosecutors, unlike in 1972, are now required to provide every relevant document to the defense. For 38 years, Romeo Phillion fought to gain his innocence, a luxury he was never afforded. While wrongful convictions occur, it is our responsibility to prevent future occurrences and provide adequate compensation for those who experience wrongful conviction.
81 years old today. It's a beautiful day. The judge has apologized for the wrongful thing happened to me. And I'm so happy. Waited 38 years for this.
Lawyer James Lockyer lost his bid to have Phillion arraigned and speedily acquitted of the murder charge, but he said that what Ratushny did made up for all that.
You know, I came here with my head down a bit. I was anxious about it, but I'm really pleased what Justice Ratushny did. It was just great for Romeo, and it was great for for the administration of justice. It's great for me too.
Lockyer is encouraging Phillion to seek a civil settlement for the years he spent behind bars.